Ukraine and that story. Something is going on in the Middle East, and something fundamental is going on. It's all going on quietly, calmly. The global community is all focused on other spaces and matters. What is going on there? It's not at all quiet. It's not at all calm in the Middle East. And a writer traveled to Moscow, Neil MacFarquhar, sorry if I mispronounced, who right now for 6 months has been a correspondent for the New York Times. And Neil kindly agreed to speak here before this class and talk about the Middle East, because this is where he spent 20 years of his life. He has good understanding of what the Arab world stands for and what is the Israeli-Arab problem about. Recently he has given me his book, and I want him to hear that I will read this book when I'm on vacation, and after that we'll have a talk to discuss it. But since this well-known book and this well-known author is here, we thought that we would make use of our good relations and invite Neil to speak here before this class. I'd like to say that I've known Neil, and I met him. You heard Michael Sulman speak here. And this is his daughter, Emma Sulman. As it turned out that she was married to Neil. So it means we all are, it's all about family relations. Americans don't like it, but this is what it is. It doesn't matter. Is that so? Please speak slowly.
Доброе утро. К сожалению,
Good morning. Regrettably, I've only been in Moscow for 3 to 4 months. The speaker says in Russian, that's why I have to switch to English.
So, as Lena said, I was a correspondent for 20 years in the Middle East. And the most important period when I worked there was for the New York Times, living in Cairo from 2001 to 2006. And then I was back again there also in 2011 and 2012. But I have also lived in Saudi Arabia, Israel, and I've worked extensively in Syria, pretty much everywhere across the region. So at some point I was back in the United States and I was having dinner with some friends. This was after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which obviously had a dramatic impact in the Middle East. And I was at a dinner, and somebody said to me, I have a question for you about the Middle East. And I always sort of shudder a little bit when that question, because the question is usually, when will there be peace? To which there is no answer. But this time, the person asked me, excuse me, but aren't there any normal people in the Middle East? All we hear about are the violence and the, you know, the extremists. And I'd like to read about people like you and me. Why don't you ever write about them? And I thought about it for a little while, and I thought it was a very reasonable question, that we tend to focus on the violence and the extremism, and we don't focus on day-to-day life. And I had first lived in the region as a very little boy. My father was a chemical engineer, and he built refineries in Libya. And we had lived a very isolated existence. We were an American community that was kind of planted in Libya, and we didn't mix with the population very much, which I always regretted later. And so I thought when I went back, I would spend my last years just talking to ordinary people and try and write more about ordinary life. So, I did that. And one of the first things I did when I went back, for example, is I wrote a story about people who own dogs. And in Russia, I think it's a very ordinary thing for people to own dogs. And in most of the West, it's a very ordinary thing for people to own dogs. But in Iran, it's illegal because it goes against the Quran. And so there is a government prohibition. They haven't actually banned it outright, but they make it illegal in other ways, like you're not allowed to walk your dog in a park.
A little bit loud.
A little bit louder?
Yeah,
Okay, sorry.
the
Interpreter's having a hard time hearing. Okay, so I'm talking about dog ownership in Iran, and they try and discourage it because the Quran says that dogs are unclean. And so I discovered that one way that people try and carry out political protest in Iran is to own a dog, because they know that it bothers the government. And so I was, every Saturday morning in Iran, there's a summary of all the sermons given in mosques. And I was in Tehran one day, and I was reading through this summary, and there was a man who said that all the people who had died fighting in the wars for Iran were very lucky because they did not live to see the day when women in Iran wear hats and men carry little dogs. So I started asking around about, why people own dogs and do they like dogs. And it turned out that this woman, because you can't buy dogs there's a criminal racket in selling stolen dogs. And so I talked to this woman, and she had taken her dog out for a walk, and it got from about here to the end of the room away from her, and two men came along on a motorcycle and stole her dog. And so she thought, well, I have to find it. And so there's actually a dog bazaar in Iran. So I went down to the dog bazaar to see what happened. And because I was a foreigner, people immediately assumed that I was looking for a dog, but you can't advertise a dog. So they would come up next to me and they'd say, got a dog? Want a dog? And then, but there were also police patrolling the area, looking for dogs and trying to confiscate dogs. And so this man got in a fight with a policeman who was trying to take his dog, and it was a big fight. I mean, he was strangling him around the neck, and there was a big argument. And a man in the crowd turned to me and he said, the problem in Iran is that there are no laws about when they arrest dogs, people who own dogs, just like when they arrest people. And it was an interesting point because it was, you think it's something ordinary, but it becomes a struggle between people and the government about how much they intercede in their lives. And so, looking at an issue like that, I started to look around the region a little bit more about what might bring political change in the Middle East. And then I spent a whole year doing that and just finding one person in one of each countries who represents an effort to change his or her country. And basically, in that year, I found that there were 6 things that were causing difficulty for people who were trying to bring change to their countries. And I did one person in every one of 6 countries to represent what those issues are. And Lena was talking about my book, and that's basically what I was writing about. And so I went to Jordan, and I wrote a story about how much the secret police control daily life in Jordan. I went to Morocco to talk about the difficulties with rule of law, because Morocco seems to have laws on its books, but they don't necessarily enforce them. I went to Saudi Arabia, where it's very difficult to organize anything because any organizations are basically illegal, so people who want to bring change have a very difficult time talking to each other. I spent time in Egypt with a member of the Muslim Brotherhood because the biggest political force in the Middle East is often, or has been, the Muslim Brotherhood, and that causes a lot of tension within the societies, but you can't bring change to that region unless you find a way to accommodate people's cultural and religious beliefs into the political system. I looked at the issue of minority rule when I was in Bahrain, because in a lot of these countries it's a small group of generals or a royal family that controls the country for generation after generation. And while that model worked through history, it's becoming more difficult now as people are demanding citizens' rights. And then I looked at the issue of generational change, and I actually did that in Syria. Because many people, when I was, I'd worked there for a long time, so when I was a young reporter and I was working there in the 80s, a lot of people said, this old generation of old kings and old presidents, they'll die out, and then their sons who have been educated in the West or know the world better will change their systems. And that turned out to be a false premise, because a lot of the sons wanted to do exactly the same as the fathers. And you can't describe all the Middle Eastern countries as the same, because they are different and they have their own traditions and their own cultures. But I think the importance of this is that we have seen a lot of extremism and religious extremism coming from that part of the world, and part of the reason is because people don't have a means of expressing themselves or saying what they want for the society, so they turn to the religion because that's the one place that that they have the freedom to express themselves. And I think the terrible situation you see now in Syria, for example, would not have happened if you had a society where people could express themselves freely. And then now I just want to sort of go over each of those issues in a little bit more detail. The secret police in the Middle East are called the Mukhabarat, and in countries like Jordan, they're everywhere, and they control a lot of things. They control who gets to be an ambassador, they control who gets to be a university professor, and just people's day-to-day lives. And I as a reporter working in that region, I never really worried about it. I figured, if they were watching me, that's fine. I have nothing to hide. But every once in a while, you would be reminded that they were watching you. And in Egypt, for example, it usually happened when I was writing a story about the Muslim Brotherhood. And, for a time, around 2003 or so, I heard that the mosque sermons were beginning to be anti-American again. They hadn't been for a little while. Then people were, some of the clerics in the mosques were beginning to make speeches about criticizing the United States, so I wanted to hear what they were saying. So I went out to try and get some cassettes, because that's how they were circulating. So I tried to buy some, and the sellers just kind of laughed at me. They wouldn't give them to me. So I had a very smart Egyptian reporter working for me. And so she went out and she bought some. And so the next day we're sitting in our office and we're listening to these cassettes of these sermons, and the phone rings, and it's somebody from the secret police. And he said, "What's on the tapes?" And my assistant was very funny and very brave, and she said, "Go buy your own." It was just a reminder that on certain sensitive topics, they wanted to know what I was doing. And, in Jordan, I met a poet, and his name was Samir al-Quda. And Samir had written a long poem critical of the lack of ability to criticize the government, because it's against the law to criticize the king. And so he said, we don't have democracy in Jordan. All we have is clapping, and we're allowed to clap. But if we don't clap, we get in trouble. And he was sent to jail for a year for that. It was called, but he came out after a year, and, he continued to work. And his sense was that, he wanted freedom of speech, and so that was the price he was willing to pay in order to try and achieve it. But, it's a difficult thing to achieve freedom of speech in many of these societies because even though the law says it exists, in reality, it doesn't. And in Morocco, I ran into this because the 23rd article of the Moroccan Constitution is just one sentence, and it says, the person of the king is sacred and inviolable. In other words, you cannot criticize the king. And this came out in all kinds of ways. There was a journalist who had written a story about a hotel. It was an old palace that was being sold, and he was taken to court because, and in the court, the lawyers for the government brought in a piece of the palace, and they put it on the desk, and they said, that's the king's property, and he criticized that, so he's indirectly criticizing the king. But the most stunning example I think I ran into was a man named Ahmed Marzouki. And when Ahmed Marzouki was 18 years old, his officers told him to take his gun and get on a truck. And they were going for a firing exercise. And they drove to a palace along the coast where there was a golf course, and they were ordered to open fire on the people playing golf. And it was senior officers who were trying to assassinate the king. And when they failed, they all went to court and they were given prison sentences. And the younger men like him who were 18 years old were given like 5 or 6 or 7 years. And the king, when he heard about that, he got very angry and he said no, and he built a special prison out in the desert and he just threw them in it. And they stayed there for 18 years until the daughter of one of the convicts was like the top student in the country. She was one of the top 10, and she won an audience with the king. He met the top 10 students, and he said, "Can I do anything for all of you?" And she said, "When are you going to let my father out of that desert prison?" And the king said, "Is anybody still alive in that prison?" And it was only then that that they began to enforce that law. And so when he came out of jail, he wasn't bitter. He just decided he was going to work for change, and he started working, to build an independent judiciary, more oversight of the police, and individual rights. And that's a problem in a lot of places, in that people feel like they don't have the right to organize political parties, or they don't have the right to organize civil society. In Saudi Arabia, I met a man who had a different interpretation of Islam. He thought that Islam, as it was originally conceived, was a much more open religion, much more spiritual religion, and that over the centuries it had become political, and it was used as an instrument of control rather than an instrument of faith. And he started writing about that, saying that, there was a group of men in the early period of Islam who started to change the way it was originally meant, and their theories had become too strong and too prevalent in Saudi Arabia. He was arrested and thrown into jail for that. And then I met another woman, a woman named Fawzia Bakr, and it's illegal for women to drive in Saudi Arabia. And she was one of a group of 40 women who were very brave, and they decided one day that they were just going to drive. So they got in their cars on the freeway in Riyadh, which it looks like an American city because it was built by American consultation. So it has these huge freeways, but women aren't allowed to use them. And so she got on the freeway, and they drove, and they only drove for about 15, 30 minutes, and they were all arrested, and they lost their jobs, and if they worked for the government, and they were really, really criticized in society and called terrible names and things like that. And I met her, this first protest happened in 1991, and I met her 15 years later when I returned to Saudi Arabia once, and she said the problem in trying to affect change in Saudi Arabia is that the government keeps us busy with all these little rules like women can't drive, and so we can't really think about, the overall direction of where our society is going. And, the problem of change also comes down to the fact that, Saudi Arabia is ruled by one family, the Al Sauds, who have about 7,000 princes, and they control everything. And it was a fine system when there was one king and about 100 princes, and he walked around with all the money the country had in a trunk. But now that it's a big modern society, it doesn't work as well. And they manage to move forward because they just have so much money from their oil wealth. But there's no sense of people participating in the government, and that causes increasing problems. And we saw when the Arab Spring started that the way Saudi Arabia responded was to put $1 billion into social programs so people could buy houses and people could get medical care and things like that, and so that they wouldn't protest against the government because they felt like the government was giving them money. But people who want a more active role find that system troubling. And I think one of the reasons that you saw the Arab uprisings happen as they did is because a lot of the countries that were not monarchies, that were supposed to be Republican governments, they saw the presidents grooming their sons to inherit the power. Libya, the son was being groomed. Several sons were being groomed. In Egypt, the son was being groomed. In Syria, the son had already taken over. And people just got angry with that because they felt like they wanted a choice and that they didn't have it. The one group that always tried to fight for this the most, to fight for change, was the Muslim Brotherhood. And the reason they were allowed to is because they could make sermons in mosques. Political parties were not allowed to organize. Civil society was not allowed to organize. But you could kind of say what you wanted in a mosque because it was considered the religious realm. And so after 1967, when everybody was kind of galvanized by the defeat in the war against Israel, then they started preaching more and more ideas that first came forward in the 1920s. And they kind of used Islam as their cultural reference point, which everybody liked. The problem is that people were a little bit suspicious of their motives, that they thought they wanted to change, they thought they wanted to tell people how to live their private lives, not just their public political lives. And sure enough, when a Muslim Brotherhood was elected president of Egypt after the revolution in 2011, he started to move in that direction and to, instead of kind of opening the society up, he was trying to turn the government into a club for the Muslim Brotherhood, and he was firing people and just hiring other Muslim brothers, and the whole thing sort of became this fight between the army and the Muslim Brotherhood over who was going to control the actual government. And a lot of the ideals of the young people who started the revolution were kind of lost because, they had basically wanted free political parties, an open system, and a more transparent government. And instead it became this fight. And I think everybody, in the Middle East, just like everywhere in the world, ordinary people's goals are all the same. They want economic security. They want, real security. They don't want to be, they don't want criminals to walk on the street. They don't want the government to attack them. They want the end of corruption, and they want they want a better life for their children. And they have not been able to achieve that in the Middle East. And, nobody saw the uprisings coming because everybody thought that, the population was too docile and, that they would not rise up. But they started, most of you probably know this, but a fruit seller who'd been attacked just one too many times by a government official in a small village in Tunis set himself on fire in December of 2010. And him committing suicide that way started a protest movement in Tunisia that spread throughout the country, and they eventually overthrew the president. And then from there it spread to other countries. It spread to Libya next door. It spread to Egypt. It spread to Yemen, it spread to Bahrain, and it spread to Syria. And there was sort of an ironic interview with the president of Syria who said, it'll never happen here after it had already started in these other 5 countries because I'm so close to the people. And it was interesting to see Syria because I had spent a lot of time there, and I knew the political activists. There were maybe 200 in the country, and they all went to the same cafe, so you could just go to one cafe and you could meet all the opposition. And when you talked to them after the uprising started, they said, we never knew that the ordinary people were as upset with this, lack of choice in the system as we were. And it was a great revelation to us. But unfortunately, the government decided that it would do anything to try to maintain its own self in power, and they sort of destroyed the country in order to maintain that. And now we see that there are 150,000 people dead, at least. There are more than 11 million displaced, and there are 3 million people, refugees in the neighboring countries. And I think what you see in all these countries is in the spirit, in the clash, in the spirit between people who want change and people who want to keep the system itself. You need certain vehicles in order to make that a success. And you need sort of political parties, and you need civil society, and you need a middle class that really cares. And the only place that has really worked is in Tunisia, because it's a very small country. It's only 10 million people. They know each other. There have been extremist attacks and assassinations against against political figures there. But overall, the country is small enough and civil society is broad enough that whenever there were these dangers or threats, the society spoke out and said, no, we want to continue this revolutionary change, and we want the system to absorb our demands. But in the other countries, it's been completely chaotic. And, we saw the same thing in Iraq, and it was a terrible mistake by the United States to overthrow that government without any plan for what comes next, because the society was just not ready to govern itself, because they didn't have those institutions that you need, the political parties and so forth, for people to be able to express themselves and to sort of organize change. And then it just becomes this terrible, fight. And that's kind of become the problem, in that the political systems there are all or nothing, because there's no system and no civil society. Everybody feels like, you either win or you're dead. And so that creates this terrible high stakes, and nobody's willing to take a chance because the cost of losing is so high. And as I said, I went back to live in the region in 2011 and 2012, and it was just so, having lived there for 25 years, it was just so uplifting to see people so optimistic about their future and feeling like for the first time in their lives they really had something to say, and they were taking their society somewhere. And, the violence came along and kind of crushed that, and it's sad to see. And, I'm hoping that spirit will stay alive, because you saw a lot of people from the young generation, people in their 20s, who, in Egypt, for example, who organized the uprising, who sort of ran for parliament for the first time. And you just really saw them saying that, I really want to be a citizen of my country for the first time. And so although this violence is terribly disheartening, I'd like to think that the spirit of those people will prevail, and in the end they will get the kind of change that they want.
Well, thank you very much for such an introduction to this subject. Well, I think that you can find such people everywhere, in every country, who would like to have a normal life. We are switching to Q&A. Please introduce yourself before you ask your question. Let's start. I'm Timur Zhakhov from Ingushetia. Good morning, Nell. My question is as follows. You know, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, any action, any party that comes to power turns their actions into religious colors just to enjoy the support of the population. So let's drop the religious context for a while. And I think I can give you my point of view based on my assessment, talking to media people. You said that the Muslim Brotherhood were formed as a political force. To the best of my knowledge, in Egypt first, they represented the elements of the civic society who started their actions with charity, helping the poor, and their activities were not well organized. Only later it took the shape of a political power. And the President Morsi, who was elected following the overthrowing of Mubarak, you said he had committed a number of mistakes. I agree with you. He was a researcher. He worked for NASA. He was quite famous researcher there, President Morsi. And but the point is different. I agree that he committed a number of errors and mistakes, but he was replaced by a dictator. And he executed dozens of people who took to the rallies against the overthrowing of President Morsi. He imprisoned hundreds and thousands of people, and by some irony, that dictator was supported by the United States. As a citizen, what I am afraid, I'm afraid that those young people in the Muslim Brotherhoods who first believed that they could do some creative work and promote civil society, they will turn their ideology and will turn to extremism. I'm afraid that they will believe that if we are killed and imprisoned, we will do the same. And it will trigger some chain reaction. And I'm afraid that that's exactly what's happening there now. Thank you.
I agree with you that it is a terrible risk that because they are, they had this great moment of hope that's going to turn to bitterness, that it's going to wreck another generation. But it's kind of interesting because what you said about the Muslim Brotherhood, I spent 5 weeks in Alexandria once following a parliamentary election in 2005, and I went to a very poor neighborhood where there was a race between a Muslim Brotherhood candidate and a very rich fruit exporter who represented the government. And the fruit exporter knew nothing. He was a charming man, but he knew nothing about his neighborhood where he was running, nothing. And the Muslim Brotherhood guy knew everything. And he had helped set up garbage collection. He had set up a health insurance system. He had set up scholarships. So he had done all the things, or he had helped, the Muslim Brotherhood had helped organize all the things that the government failed to do. But the problem, as you said, and as I said earlier, is that when they came to power, because they had been oppressed for so many years, it was a spirit of revenge, really, and they just kind of wanted to do to the people who had oppressed them, to make them suffer the way they had. And it was interesting because the older members of the Muslim Brotherhood, they were in their 70s and 80s, and they'd been to jail, when Nasser took over in the 1950s and again in the 1960s when they suppressed them, they'd been to jail for years. So they were very secretive and very sort of closeted. And the younger generation, and there was a group of about 36 30, 36 young people who organized the protests in Tahrir when they first started. And there was some Muslim Brotherhood in that. And they blogged and they tweeted. And, you know, the older generation was horrified. And they said, stop blogging, stop tweeting. And so those people just split off and formed on their own. But again, they were prosecuted by the government. And it was just kind of, it was interesting to me to watch, because the way the government treated the country in terms of not allowing free choice, and political parties were allowed, but they weren't really allowed. They couldn't really organize. So again, it was a rule on paper, but they were all exactly like the government. You know, all the leaders were in their 70s and 80s. They wouldn't let the young generation come up. When the younger generation did like stage a coup within a party and try and run and take over, they were all kicked out. So I think there is a huge problem right now that in being oppressed again, they're going to radicalize, you know, and another generation that just doesn't believe in the political system, and it's unfortunate because there was a generation there that really did want to make the system work.
Коллеги, доброе утро. Продолжаем.
Good morning, dear colleagues. Let's move on. Vakhtang, your question, please. Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank you for a most interesting talk. Vakhtang, will you introduce yourself? Sorry, I'm Vakhtang Satsanava. I'm a graduate of the Tbilisi Political School. So thank you very much for your talk. I wonder where I can get this book so that to read it thoroughly. My question is as follows. You are a reporter, a columnist. So I wonder, what is the policy of the current U.S. administration towards Middle East countries? And we know that the so-called Arab Spring, perhaps in all the countries, raised new headache. And in Egypt, it was not Mohammed el-Baradei who was elected, who was believed to be elected, but more radical people came to power. Similar situation is observed in Libya. We are aware of the latest sad events in Iraq, and we do not know who can replace Bashar al-Assad. So I wonder if the U.S. administration just supports democratic movements now, just to help them to overthrow dictators, or perhaps the administration policy does not look into the future.
I'm a journalist, and I spend most of my time outside the United States, so I can't speak for the United States government, and I don't follow their day-to-day debates. But overall, I think that starting very early on, right after 9/11, there was sort of a realization in the United States that they had made a mistake, and they said, as the Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said, we supported stability over democracy and got neither. And so they were going to change that. But I think the mistake that they made is they thought that elections were the one-step solution, and they thought that once people got to vote, then all the problems would go away, because that meant that they were exercising their civil rights and so forth. And then the U.S. was kind of horrified, because the first election that came after that policy was enunciated was Hamas won in Gaza, and they were kind of like, well, that's not what we had in mind. And I think that they are kind of groping now to figure out, how to choose between this sort of chaos that you see developing in the region and the stability that they had long tried to engender. And they thought it was just going to come with elections, but they didn't realize, and that's the mess that the U.S. created in Iraq, is that they didn't realize that the building blocks were not there. And I think they're desperately trying to figure out a way to put those building blocks in place, but they don't want to, they don't want to undermine long-term allies like the government of Saudi Arabia, which represents a lot of their interests in the region. And so I think they don't know what to do, and so you see them you see the American government kind of withdrawing from the area, and its influence diminishing, and it's unfortunate, because it's just going to increase the spiral of violence there, which doesn't help anybody.
Так, Юрий, пожалуйста.
Yuri, your question, please. I'm Yuri Labanov from the city of Bryansk. In the Middle East, virtually in all the countries, people want to live better and have an opportunity to be civilized. We understand what they are striving for. People want to be full-fledged citizens, but the outcome is that they are either put to prison or they have to immigrate to leave the country. Perhaps that's the way, that's the case when theory and the practice do not coincide. Perhaps they should drop off their aspirations and stop trying to become full-fledged citizens.
I mean, I think that would be sad if they tried to stop their aspirations. It's the idea that they have to. You have to get enough people to support the idea of change that the government is forced to, and I think that started to happen in 2011 and 2012, and then because of the chaos that came, I mean, certainly in Egypt the economy has collapsed almost, and tourism, which was one of the four pillars of the economy, has evaporated and so forth, that people suddenly grew fearful again. And for a while in Egypt, people would tell you the fear is gone, we can do what we want, and now they're fearful again just for their own economic lives, because most people are not involved in the political system, and they just want to live their lives, and they want their lives to improve, but they don't necessarily want to be participating actively in it. And I think that because of the chaos that those uprisings all engendered, that there's another generation that says the former stability was better, and we shouldn't rock the boat. But those systems had a lot of problems, and certainly Egypt under Mr. Mubarak was very stagnant, and I just think that it's up to the people to try and change their system, and you can't do it in the face of terrible government violence. You can't expect people to do it, but I think that those younger activists certainly, from what they did in Tahrir, know they could accomplish something, and I don't know how long. I don't know how long they'll have to postpone it. Maybe another generation, but I think that that spirit will keep, coming through no matter what the government does.
Так, продолжаем.
Let's move on with our questions. So finally, we have a question from a Croatian person.
Privilege to work as a reporter in many of those countries that you have mentioned. So I have just two questions. Do you think that, of course, the freedom, yearning for freedom, it's a universal value, and looking for your life to be better and to be fulfilled citizens. But do you think that all this, what happened with the Arab Spring, has proven that democracy of Western type could not be applied to all those societies? That this is a fundamental mistake, that Westerners do not understand because they do not know so much about the cultural religion on the first place. And about Libya, where you have lived, we are witnessing that it's becoming new Somalia, While it was convenient for the West to buy oil from Gaddafi and, to pay him to restrain immigrants not to come to Europe, and while he was financing President Sarkozy campaign, he was a good guy. What does that talk about the hypocrisy of Westerners, and who's going to pay this bill for the Arab Spring and consequences that this has given?
On the first question, there's often argued that democracy is like a gene, and some people have it and some people don't, and I just don't think that's true. I think it's a question of experience and culture to a certain extent. But I think if fundamentally people would like to have a say over their own lives, and it's an imperfect system, but it is the only system that's been developed that finds a way for people to express themselves. And, you know, I think that the problem in that region, like I just said, is that, you know, people expect you to, you know, it developed in Europe over hundreds of years, you know, in the culmination of the fight for fundamental rights in Europe kind of came together in the United States, but it took several hundred years of fighting, and sort of we look at the Middle East, and because of the news cycle and everything else, we expect, you know, in a year or two, it's all going to happen. And you look at, you know, previous revolutions like the French Revolution, and sort of their, you know, 10 years on, they were still fighting, and the terror was sort of reaching its culmination. So I think that expectations are a little too high, that change will be immediate. And, you know, yeah, it's up to people in every country to pick the system they want. If they don't want democracy, then it's none of the world's, you know, business on the outside to dictate to them that that's the system that they should have. I mean, they should be able to choose its color and its, you know, how it works in their country. But just to say, you know, it doesn't work there without giving it a full chance, I think is wrong. Yeah, and Libya is a terrible situation because, again, that, you know, I mean, Gaddafi worked night and day to make sure that there was no institution that could challenge him. So there were no political parties, there was no army, there were no labor unions, there was no, you know, he changed the government ministers all the time, and so he built that country so that it depended solely on him. And, you know, whatever he wanted to do, no matter what, I mean, I was, you know, when I was writing my book, I was looking for examples, and one day he decided that Libyans were not sufficiently connected to their rural roots, and so everybody should grow chickens at home. And so they were all forced to have chickens at home, and the cost of the chickens was deducted from their salary, since most of them worked for the government, and they also had to buy the coop to keep the chicken in. And, you know, I talked to Libyans, and they said, we live in apartments in the city. What are we going to do with a chicken? You know, most of us just killed the first two and used the coop as a new dish rack. And so, you know, they had lived through these 40 years of chaos, and you can't, like, decapitate a system like that and then suddenly, you know, expect a new one to stand up instantly and work. And, you know, I think the hope on the part of the Western governments, which was probably misguided, was that, you know, they could kind of ignore it, and there's only 6 million people in Libya, and it would kind of take care of itself. And it's not. And, you know, I don't know what the answer is, really. I don't think there is an answer until the people in the country themselves, you know, sort of assert their desire for more stability. But there's no sign how they can do that at the moment.
Yuri shared his remembrances with me, telling that people were forced to plant cucumbers and potatoes in their homes and around during the Stalin era. That's a very interesting parallel to draw. A question from Romania. You're welcome, Miss.
I would like to go a bit back. Oh, I'm Christina. I'm from Romania. Hi. I would like to go back to the Russian context, and I'm quite curious, and maybe other people are curious too. Maybe you could discuss a little bit what prompted your decision, or maybe it wasn't your decision, or what were the events that led up for you to move away from the Middle East and come to Russia? That's like the first part. And second of all, do you see any parallels in terms of, I don't know, civic engagements between the Middle East and Russia today? Thank you.
When I was a student in the university, there was a very famous movie that came out in the United States about John Reed. And John Reed, I think, is the only American buried in the Kremlin Wall because he came here during the revolution and sort of tried to participate. And I just thought it was a fascinating story, and so I started reading Russian history and culture, etc. And so I told my bosses that I want to go to Russia. And they said, well, that's great, but you speak Arabic and you grew up in the Middle East, so why don't you just go there for 2 or 3 years, and then we'll send you to Russia. 20 years later, I got my wish. And, you know, obviously it was an interesting run in the Middle East, and because I grew up there as a child, you know, I feel at home there, and I feel a part of it, but I just, I think, you know, I as I got older, I got less and less enamored of covering violence, and I didn't want to write about violence anymore. And I just thought, you know, I sort of resurrected that old dream that I wanted to come to Russia because it's just such a big, interesting country, and so forth. And, you know, I think there are parallels, obviously, because, you know, Russia has also come out of a totalitarian system, and they're trying to figure out, you know, what the next step is. But I don't think I've really spent enough time here to kind of know how the mechanics work and how that process is working. I mean, obviously, I know that people have raised concerns that, you know, some of their freedoms in terms of the internet and things like that are being curtailed. But, you know, and again, I think it comes back to the fact that every people have to sort of find their own path toward the system of government that they want, and it can't be dictated from outside. I mean, outsiders can encourage them, but those decisions and those choices have to be made internally.
Пожалуйста, коллеги. Петербург. Прошу, господин Крылов.
Константин Крылов, Санкт-Петербург. In the 1970s, the American scholar Clifford Geertz described the political struggle in Indian Ocean region as a struggle between essentialists, people who thought about modernization of their countries on their own Asian way, and apocalyptics, as the people who thought about modernization of their countries on the Western way. So, is it possible to use this scheme for description of the Maghreb political struggle in the countries of the Maghreb, and maybe our scheme about that nowadays in Arabian countries the political struggle is the struggle between just military regimes and Western people. Is it not so good?
I'm not familiar with the work you referred to, but just in the Middle Eastern context, there obviously is a sentiment that, you know, the West was the colonial power in the region for many, many years, and that they need to shake off that heritage by avoiding any kind of system of government or societal, you know, means of organizing the society that reflects the West, and they need to find their own path, and that the only way they will ever sort of shake off their legacy of the colonial period is to, you know, use Islam and their own culture in order to find that route. And there are governments that argue like that, in terms of Saudi Arabia, for example, in trying to justify the absolute rule of the monarchy there. But then you have scholars like, you know, the man I met who said, you know, that Islam has been perverted, and it was actually a very open system and a just system, and we have to get back to those, you know, roots of the religion in order to get away from the way it has been warped to excuse a system of government that has gone on for much too long. And I think that a lot of the violence that you see, although it's directed at the West, is actually a fight within Islam itself about that future, and, you know, how you interpret the faith and how you use it, because that is their sort of cultural compass, how they can build a system that both speaks to people's dreams and, meets their cultural aspirations without just aping, the West directly. And I think that's what we're seeing in the terrible turmoil in that part of the world.
Так, балканский натиск продолжается. Пожалуйста. Босния и Герцеговина.
We're having more questions from the Balkans.
Bosnia. So I would like to hear your opinion about civil society in Middle East countries. What do you think, how possible is for civil society to appear in those countries? I mean, real civil society, real NGO sector that will be able to make dialogue between government and citizens. Thank you.
I worked in Bosnia in the early 1990s, an unfortunate period, but I had been there as a student also, so I know it's a very beautiful country. It varies. It just, it's not monolithic because the rules are different in every country. And in countries like Morocco, for example, there's a very, very strong civil society. And in countries like Saudi Arabia, where any organization is banned, it's very, very weak. And Morocco is sort of an interesting case because, when I was looking for my character that represents sort of an agent of change, I spent a lot of time with people working in civil society, and some of them were incredible. There was a woman that had set up an education system for juveniles in prison, so anybody under 18 had the chance to learn a trade, learn how to fix cars, or to sort of move them away from their criminal past and give them a trade. And I arrived in Casablanca at like 4 o'clock on one day, and I called her up and I said, I hear you have this great NGO that's working in the prisons, could I visit one? And we were in one at 9 o'clock, the next morning, and she was ordering the guards around, and she was ordering the students around, and they obviously loved her because she kind of protected them in a way, and she made sure that the system was working. And I met another women's organization, because there used to be sort of child marriage in Morocco, and I think the marriage age was, I can't remember now if it was 9 or 12, it was very low, and they had fought to raise it to 15, and also to change the rules. So, because in Islam, you're allowed to take a second wife, that if a man took a second wife, he had to tell his first wife, which before they didn't do. And at first, everybody kind of ignored the rules, and the police didn't enforce them. And then the king spoke up and he said, I support this change. And that, created a difference overnight because the king had spoken. And so then the police began enforcing the rule and making sure that, the first wife wasn't thrown out of the house if the second wife was taken and so forth. So, it was kind of an interesting situation because they had opened up the laws to let NGOs work as they wanted to, but without a mandate from the palace, it didn't always work. But they did have a lot of room to criticize and to operate. But that, again, that didn't translate automatically into a change in the system, but it began, people thinking about it. And, in other places like Syria, for example, Saudi Arabia, there's almost none. And in Syria, the only way they could get them started was if the wife of the president sort of agreed with them. So everybody would try and get support for her. Morocco represents the best case because they opened up the laws and let virtually any NGO that wanted to work. And so, there was a lot more civic participation, but it also didn't automatically translate into, a different system of government.
Коллега, вот передо мной из второй ряд.
My colleague from the second row, please.
Да, прошу, быстрее. Представляйтесь.
Hello, Mateusz from Poland. I want to ask, how do you see the presence of European countries in the Middle East, and do you believe that European Union will have like coherent foreign politic towards these countries?
You know, the relations tend to form along old colonial lines. So, you know, the French, for example, have the strongest relations with Lebanon and Syria because they were the old colonial power. And although there is an EU foreign policy, coordinated foreign policy, you know, there's 28 countries, and we see all the time how difficult they have coming up with a unified structure. I think that you know, that they are trying to be more coherent as the U.S. kind of pulls back because they're next door and they're worried about Islamization and they're worried about immigration. So I think that they're trying to make a more concentrated effort to help, and you know, you see them in aiding, they're stepping up their aid programs in a way. But I don't think they've come up. I don't think anybody's come up with a coherent way to address that. Just because the changes in the past 3 years in the Middle East have been so profound that everybody's still trying to kind of groping in the dark and figuring out how to relate to these different countries that are falling apart.
Прошу, Эдуард.
Eduard Amirov from Bashkortostan. The strengthening of ties between Russia and Israel is a source of vexation to the U.S. government. Do you believe you know a reason why it annoys them?
You know, I think that there's long been competition between Russia and the United States for influence throughout the Middle East. And for a while, the United States felt like it was gaining the upper hand, and now maybe it feels like it's not. But I would argue with you that you know, the relationship between Israel and the United States is so strong that I don't think any country you know, would supplant that. And even if the relations between the American president and the Israeli prime minister at the moment are particularly bad, I don't think you'll see any, you know, sort of weakening of those ties overall.
Так, продолжаем. Коллега.
Stanislav Avramenko from Rostov-on-Don. I've noticed that when you work in the countries which then undergo color revolutions, now you've come to Russia, so you have an experience of monitoring these processes in a way, and in the countries where such revolutions take place, chaos ensues that leads to casualties and undermining of infrastructure. What would you recommend to the democratic forces in Russia, which on the one hand want to change the regime but do not want to slide into chaos? So what is missing for the democratic forces to preserve us from sliding into chaos? Have you by any chance noticed the topic of this lecture? Oh yes. Oh, that's a fine question. Well, how about the experience, using the experience? Well, there we see the dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. Well, I shall certainly advise you where to turn to. But this question is not according to the agenda. I apologize. Maria, please. Maria Yashko from Moscow. I would like to ask your opinion about the role of online and web communities and the social networks in the Arab Spring events, and what was the role of internet technologies in such protests?
Just one point on the previous question is that I left the Middle East in 2006, and the uprising started in 2011. So I wasn't actually there for them. I got sent back for them.
Тем более, видите, алиби у нашего эксперта, так что...
But in terms of the internet, it played an enormous role because it linked people who didn't have a way to communicate previously. And although in Tunisia, that horrible death that the fruit seller committed in burning himself to death kind of galvanized the country, and it was first spread on social media. But the place you really saw the biggest organizing was in Egypt, because I'm going to forget the dates exactly, but about a year before the uprising, there was a young computer-savvy person in Alexandria in Egypt who was arrested by the police and ended up dead, and they had sort of beaten him to death. And his family was not quiet about it. And I think his name is Khalid Said, if I remember. And so they started a Facebook page, some activists saying, "We are all Khalid Said." And that kind of page, everybody, that all the people who wanted political change, who didn't necessarily know each other, suddenly subscribed to that page and were on it and were active. And that kind of created a core group that began the protest movement. And you saw that happening in other countries as well. And out of that core group came the connections that started the 30 people working together to create the protest in Tahrir Square that eventually brought down President Mubarak. But that being said, it's a substitute for sort of a lack of free press and a lack of access to the media, et cetera. I mean, there is enormous Twitter usage in Saudi Arabia just because there's no free media at all. And so everybody just discusses everything on Twitter, and you go on there and you see what's happening in the country. But it's, it's kind of, it allows people to communicate with each other, but it doesn't by itself bring change because it's kind of, it's in space somewhere. And it isn't sort of, I think that the 30 activists in Egypt basically said, yes, we were all on Facebook, but, we had to go down into Tahrir Square to actually make our presence felt, because we could have just talked forever on Facebook and everybody would have, been interested in the topic, etc., but it would not necessarily have brought change.
Денис Бураков, наш выпускник.
Denis Burakov, our alumnus.
A few words about the differences between oil-rich nations and resource-poor nations in the Middle East. And to be more precise, would you agree with the statement that people in oil-rich countries tend to have a lesser proclivity towards democracy because they receive more public goods and therefore they're less likely to rebel? Thank you.
The joke that Saudi activists tell among themselves is that they're just about to get everyone to get up off their couches and go create change, and then another wave of cash falls over them and they say, oh, let's just sit back down for a little while. And I think, there's an element of truth in that the governments, especially in those, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is Saudi, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Dubai, Oman, and Bahrain, they have an enormous amount of wealth, and so they kind of buy social peace by using that money. And education is free, medical care is free. A lot of people work for the government, and they get very generous vacation benefits. And then whenever a crisis, kind of comes up, they add more, like they did, in Saudi Arabia. There's a big problem with housing, because there isn't a mortgage industry, because mortgages are illegal, so people can't really get bank loans to buy houses, so they depend on the government to be granted housing. And, back in the 70s, when there was a huge oil boom and the population was tiny, it was under 10 million, if I remember correctly, they could give people houses fairly easily. And now that the population is up to 28 million, they can. And so the wait for a government house is stretched to a decade or longer. So one of the things you saw the king do right after the Arab Spring, erupted elsewhere was to say there's going to be a huge program of building houses. And interestingly enough, Bahrain, which is the smallest and poorest of the group and has the biggest, there's a big sectarian difference between the Sunnis and the Shiites there, was the one country among those which exploded because the government hasn't had the money to sort of buy off its opposition with social programs. And, it's interesting in Saudi Arabia, too, that the government's willingness to entertain demands for reform changes with the price of oil. So when the price of oil collapsed in the 1980s, they were much more willing to do things, and they kind of opened a consultative council, didn't have any legal power, but at least it could discuss issues. And then, when the price of oil shot back up, they began to, close those things down. So it kind of has a direct effect on the ability of people to ask for change.
Так, продолжаем.
Mr. Oms from Krasnoyarsk, taking into account your monitoring, your experience or an experience in monitoring the human rights, in your view, which countries are not sufficiently democratized in the Middle East?
I'm afraid I'd have to say all of them. I mean, it's a very difficult subject, and even in ones where you see, a certain amount. I mean, there are strong parliaments in a few countries, like Kuwait has a strong parliament, and Lebanon has a terrible kind of. I mean, it has a parliament that functions, and a free press, so people are allowed to make more noise there. But even in Kuwait, you just saw someone given, I think it was a 5-year jail sentence for tweeting criticism about the prince who rules the country. So I think people are trying to change that, but they have a long way to go.
Коллеги, пожалуйста. Прошу, Марина.
Добрый день, меня зовут...
Good morning. I'm Marina Ilyushenko from Khabarovsk. You have studied the Middle East for many years. It is a surprising and a beautiful region with a magnificent history. What is it that may still be a source of surprise for you? And what is it that you, as a professional journalist, would like to devote time in the subsequent years?
I think that I think what I like most about it is people are just wonderful. They're very hospitable. They're very generous, very warm. Something will happen to you on a highway. You'll lose a tire or something, and someone will drive, 100 kilometers out of their way to help you. And also, I think it's also a mark of repressive governments is that they all have wonderful sense of humor. They have an ability to kind of laugh at the world that makes life a lot easier. And Egypt in particular, and if they didn't have it, I'm sure conditions there would be even more difficult. But as I said, I mean, I can't hide the fact that I was there was this incredible uplifting moment which nobody expected. I mean, that was a huge surprise because nobody really expected, a political uprising in any country, much less in 6 at once. And then they haven't turned out the way many of the younger organizers hoped, and that's a source of disappointment to them. and to me. And it was one of the reasons that, why I wanted to change cultures. And Russia's this huge country, so I'm very eager to explore it.
Прошу.
Andrei Berezhny from Mineralные Vody in the North Caucasus. The policy, the U.S. policies in the Middle East over the past years has not been particularly successful, or does not seem to have been particularly successful, and the population in the United States has some support for some policies. But do you believe that there is a wave of change in the society, in how the society treats it? And do you believe that the U.S. citizens, have any pronounced interest towards it?
There has been a string of disasters. And it's interesting to me as a journalist, because when you travel around the Middle East and you meet American officials or government officials who actually work in the region, they know an enormous amount about it, and they understand it. And somewhere in the communication back to Washington, a lot of that understanding seems to get lost. And I think the explanation is that a lot of times, sort of the domestic political fight, whatever they are at the moment, between the Democrats and the Republicans, tends to take over, and so they do what helps them politically, as opposed to the smart thing to do. And as an observer, I always wish that they would do the smart thing as opposed to the political thing. And I think the United States. It's a big country, but because it's a big country, a little bit like Russia, there's a lot of people that never leave it, and they look at the outside world through the prism of the news, and they've sort of had a decade now of these overseas wars, and they saw 4,500 American soldiers killed in Iraq. And the country falling apart again, and a long war in Afghanistan. And I think the general sentiment in the United States is like, we need to stay at home and fix our bridges and roads and airports and highways, and stop trying to be the world's policeman. Is I think the general public sentiment at the moment.
Саша, прошу вас. Как на Ближнем Востоке говорят, last
but not least, that's yours. Chernov Alexander from Bryansk, city of Bryansk. Have you had any personal doubts with respect to the export of democracy to the Middle Eastern cultures and societies, and that they have their ways, they have their conventions and traditions which may not be quite understood by us in Russia, or even more so by the people in the West, and the number of people who wish the change may be too small in comparison with those who do not wish any change, and those who are protesters may not be willing real or true democracy, but are rather trying to protest against the particular dictators, like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. They might not need democracy in the classical Western sense, but they may just be willing to get rid of the dictator, make some cosmetic changes, and go on living like they did.
It's an interesting question, because I am an outsider, and outsiders don't necessarily know exactly how the society works. But I think I come back to the issue of sort of talking to those 30 young people who organized the protests in Tahrir Square, and they were not all of the same political stripe. Some were, capitalists, some were socialists, some were Muslim Brotherhood, but they all wanted the chance to express themselves in society, to organize political parties. And, it was kind of interesting to look at, the sort of secular pro-business kind of parties, because it is the group that's maybe closest to the way political parties work in the West. And you would look at what they were doing, and they were sort of, because it's close to my own culture, you sort of identify with that to a certain extent. You think, well, that's interesting. They're trying to do something that works in the West. But they were terrible at organizing. They spoke beautifully. They had interesting ideas, but they just didn't go into the villages in Egypt to build a constituency. And I think they were beginning to understand that that was a mistake that they had made, that they sort of talked too much among themselves. And I take your point that maybe the Western system isn't the right one for the region. But I think the important point is not necessarily what system they choose, but that they have the opportunity to choose it, and they have the opportunity to try to build it. And I think that right is what has been denied them for so many years, and that's what they want to try.
Антон, пожалуйста, прошу вас.
Anton Khvastov from Saratov. I wanted to ask a question about Iran, if I may. How do you view the hypothesis that Iran and the United States are sort of clandestine allies, and that the U.S. was helping Iran sometimes in a secret way, and that Iran might help the U.S. with oil? And these countries, that the U.S. and Iran are only roaring at each other just for the political moment. How do you... Yes, Anton, and I would also like to comment that North Korea and the United States are also clandestine allies. It's just nobody has ever made it out.
Having spent time in the Middle East, I know that closed societies love nothing better than a conspiracy theory. But unfortunately, I don't subscribe to very many of them. And I think that, if you look at the situation over the years in the way they've confronted each other, like the taking of the American hostages, which basically lost President Carter his presidency, and the various clashes, either directly or indirectly, through the Iran-Iraq war. I think they are at loggerheads, and it's kind of one of the great ironies that those of us that work in the Middle East for American news publications discover is that the country that has the worst diplomatic relations with the Americans has the population that loves the United States the most. And when you spend time in Tehran, there is almost no hostility to me personally as an American. People just love to talk to me, and I think it's sort of a paradox, because the political forces in Iran know that any party or any group that makes a breakthrough and establishes relations with the United States will be hugely popular at home, because not least because things like sanctions on airplanes and just a lot of the problems they have in day-to-day life will be lifted. But it's difficult for Iran to do, because they have made, and this is why I don't think that hypothesis of a secret accord works, because from the beginning of the revolution in 1979, they made hostility towards the United States kind of a symbol of hostility toward the West as they're going their own route, and it has kind of become a pillar of, the revolution, and so they can't dismantle it without calling into question, the entire basis of that revolution.
Последний вопрос, коллега, прошу.
The last question from the High School of Economics in Moscow. Oh, no, Mr. Yamanchikov from the Tyumen region. We've been talking about the relations between the Middle East and the US, the Middle East and the European Union, but clearly the Middle East is not a monolith, and it has very diverse forces and currents. How could you evaluate the influence of such countries as Saudi Arabia and Qatar as the most powerful countries onto the Arab Spring processes and revolutions?
It's been kind of mixed, and they're kind of fighting with each other because there's a sense that Qatar was funding the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in Egypt, and kind of using Al Jazeera, their television channel they own, to help foment and spread the revolutions everywhere in the region. They gave very positive coverage to the uprising in Tunisia at the beginning, whereas Saudi Arabia is a very conservative society that doesn't want any change in the region, and has sort of been at loggerheads with the Muslim Brotherhood for many years now because they see them as a competitor in terms of a Muslim ideology. So, on the one hand, you had Qatar that seemed to be pushing them along, and on the other hand, you had Saudi Arabia that was kind of pulling them back. And, again, it's hard to sort of give a monolithic answer for all the revolutions because there were different ones, in Syria, for example, because Iran began supporting President Assad, the Sunni Arab regimes who are opposed to Iran and gaining any influence in the region began supporting the rebels and sort of abandoned Assad, whereas they had been his ally before the revolution. So, as usual, their role in the region has been as kind of bankers. They pour a lot of money into these situations, but they don't necessarily solve them.
Коллеги, больше не будет вопросов.
Colleagues, there will be no further questions as our time is up. This is excellent that we have touched up this topic and considered it, we've treated it in a world where the world is moving from order to disorder, or at least so it seems, and it is especially vivid in the regions of the Middle East and the North Africa. In our perception of these problems is that we are still thinking about these processes in the categories of the Arab Spring, but there is some indication that the Arab Spring has stopped and has now been substituted with the Arab Autumn, and it appears that Egypt has got back to point zero, where from the so-called Arab Spring started, or the revolution in Egypt, and the man who is very much like Hosni Mubarak is now at the helm of the country, and it appears that people seem to be content with it, and hundreds of thousands of people who went to the Tahrir Square feel themselves to be duped. The press tells us that we watch and look at the Arab world as a monolith. There is no such thing as the Arab world. There is a big number of states, affiliations, communities and groups, and that our esteemed expert has allowed us to view this very unorderly and beautiful world. And of course, we're not even touching upon the topic of Israeli-Arab relations. So the fact that our expert has allowed us to glean something from this subject is a great achievement. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope I can come back soon.
Перерыв, коллеги.